topic of this lecture is Anglican and Episcopal mission in the Muslim world, specifically what we would today call the Middle East. So I'm not going to be really talking very much about India and Pakistan. Some areas are really largely left out because while other groups and other churches send missionaries there, Anglicans did not. So there was not a whole lot of missionary activity in North Africa, for example, outside of Egypt. So that's, again, just a kind of a blank spot. And I struggled with trying to decide what title I should give to this. I told you the topic of it, but what's the title of this? And I kept on coming back to a phrase from T.S. Eliot, where he said, "In my end is my beginning." And he also has the other phrase, "In my beginning is my end." And I kept on thinking about that. That's from Eliot's Four Quartets. And I kept on thinking about that as I've just turned over this material in my mind over the last couple of days and indeed years, which is when I started studying this topic. Because I think that Anglicans and Episcopalians, I'm just going to use Anglicans from now on as shorthand, Anglicans by and large, they went to these really distant places like Kurdistan and Constantinople and Salt in Jordan, just to find out that even though they had great, ambitious plans, that in the end, the places where they had started, the situations and the arguments and the differences of opinion that they had started with back in largely England and the United States, had really followed them, and that the mission field in many ways served as a place where those differences could be augmented. They could be written large. Many of the societal forces that would have minimized those differences, say in London or in Connecticut or Richmond, Virginia, or what have you, were absent in the mission field. So they were able to become larger than life. But let me tell you a little bit about some of the main figures here. What do we know about Anglicans, and specifically what do we know about Anglicans who are going to become missionaries in the Middle East? Well, I guess the first period that we'd have to talk about is really not so much missionaries. I mean, remember that Protestants didn't send missionaries anywhere for centuries after the Reformation. Every now and then they would send chaplains. They would send, an English chaplain along with the place, along with the group of people who were going to start what they used to call a factory over in fill in the blank, whatever city they were going to start their factory in. And indeed, that's how a lot of the Anglican communion came into being. But that's a very different thing, though, than appointing someone to be a missionary and to go out and to engage in evangelism, founding new congregations, and so on. So the first period of time that I would want to talk about is really what we would call the period of the chaplains. And I want to just mention two chaplains to you. The first one is a very celebrated figure. His name is Henry Martyn. That's Martyn, born in 1781, and he passed away in 1812. So relatively young man when he died. He was an Anglican missionary in India and Persia, and he was a chaplain. That's how he was able to go. At this time, there was no missionary society of the Church of England, or you couldn't go to your diocesan body and say, "Look, I want to be appointed to be a missionary to fill in the blank." So he went as a chaplain with the, I believe it was the British East India Company, And most of the Anglicans who were going all over the world at this time, in terms of chaplains, they had their job. And their job was to say morning prayer and to say evening prayer and to do the things that chaplains did. And just because you're a chaplain in what would become like Pakistan or Bangladesh, that doesn't mean that you are doing any evangelism. It doesn't mean that you're learning the local language. It doesn't mean that you have any real understanding or insight into the religion or the culture of the people around you. What it means is that you're being paid by a company to fulfill certain religious obligations to the people of that company. And by and large, that's what the chaplains did. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and I want to give you two of them. One of them is Martin. Now, you'll notice that Martin died fairly young, 81 to 1812. So that tells you that he was a whopping 31 years old or so when he passed away. What kind of stuff did Martin do? Well, he was, I don't know the exact reasons for this, but he was able to engage in a lot more travel, and he had a lot more freedom than did many of the chaplains at the time. And he translated portions of the Bible and the prayer book as well into languages like Urdu, which is one of the predominant languages in Pakistan, and Farsi, which is the predominant language in Persia. Persia and Farsi they're the same word. They're two different ways of saying the same word, or what is today Iran. And Martin was indeed an Anglican missionary. He was an Anglican chaplain, and he died in the city of Tokat. So like so many of these early missionaries, he died in the mission field. The missionaries, their wives, their children, they almost all died in the mission field. And Martin was no exception to that rule. And Martin is one of the first ones. He presaged several of the tendencies that we'd see later on in other missionary activities, especially his love of translation, and also his very evangelical conviction that as long as you can give someone the Bible in their own language, that will get them to the Christian faith. There's some kind of powerful sacramental act just in giving the person a Bible in their language that almost assures that, I don't say almost assures, but makes it quite likely that they will become Christian. And indeed, when we read testimonies of Muslims then and now, coming into contact with the Bible is indeed one of the main avenues or factors that we find in those conversion testimonies. So Martin was a chaplain. Another chaplain was a guy named Henry Mondrell, and he was earlier than Martin. This is a very early chaplain, and he was with the Turkey Company. Okay, so the British Turkey Company. So this is a trade conglomerate or a trade company that did commerce between Turkey or Anatolia and the UK, or Great Britain. And he wrote what would go on to be published and translated. He wrote a great book that you can get on books.google for free if you don't mind sitting in front of your computer and reading for hours, which I don't mind. I don't like it, but I do it. And he, in 1697, so notice how early that is, 1697. So this is many decades before our country even comes into existence. In 1697, he and some of the other employees of that company made their pilgrimage down to Jerusalem, and he passed the Triduum from Good Friday to Easter Sunday in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre with the Latins or Roman Catholics in 1697. And his book is just really enjoyable, and it's got great passages from his visit to Jerusalem, but also several other places, including he stopped by Nazareth. It also has some nice maps and some drawings in it that are worth your time. But at this point, again, remember, this is a chaplain. So when he's doing this, when he's going to Jerusalem and traveling through these villages that are Palestinian or Arab or what have you, including largely Muslim villages, he's not going there to evangelize. I mean, he has his job, he's got time off, and he knows that during this time off he can go down to Jerusalem. Or indeed, maybe going to Jerusalem as a chaplain with some of the other employees of that company, maybe that was part of his job. I'm not sure on that detail. But the point is, he was definitely not going out there to start a church. One of the things that I really enjoy about his kind of travel log, or the record of his journey, is that it is replete with scriptural references. This is a man who knows the Bible like the back of his hand, including some of the rather obscure ones, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and where different battles occurred and stuff like that. So that was an influential volume. So those are two examples of the chaplain period, the chaplaincy period, when you did not have organized missions, but you had Anglicans going out and being in other places, and in some cases, like Martin, translating scripture into local languages. In the case of Mondrel, writing down what he saw back for the audience at home. So it was an important beginning, but not what we would generally consider today to be missions. Now, in 1792, okay, so this is when Henry Martin is a young boy of 3 years old or so. 1792, this is when Henry Martin is 11 years old. In 1792, a Baptist named William Carey publishes a book with one of these charmingly prolix titles, An Enquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. He becomes a Baptist missionary to India, and like all the missionaries, he dies there. But this book is going to change it's going to just change history, really. The book is short. Again, you can find it for free online. Thanks be to God, this stuff wasn't copyrighted back then. And in this book, Carey is saying, look, you can't just assume that the heathens are going to kind of on their own spontaneously decide to be Christians. You have to use means. You have to use financial means. You have to use organizational means. You have to found societies who are able to coordinate this work and who know about this work. Because then, as now, if you go to your average parish and you say, well, what does it entail being a missionary in the Middle East? The average parish, even if it's very missions-minded, is going to say, we really don't know. If you go to your average parish and you say, what should we do in terms of getting health insurance, like international health insurance for missionaries? Your average parish is going to say, we have no idea. So you have to have societies, organizations that specialize in this sort of thing, that know how to do this, and that can come alongside the established church and help the church to do this. And this is the beginning of all the different missionary societies. So eventually, it takes them a while, but the Church of England catches up with this, and it'll take the Episcopal Church in the United States quite a bit longer. So let me just throw some dates at you. 1799, okay? So this is 7 years after the publication of this book. The most venerable and important of all the missionary societies of Anglicanism is founded, and that's the CMS, the Church Mission Society. I think the name says it all, the Church Mission Society. And many of the characters that we're going to run into in the coming narrative are indeed CMS missionaries. And the CMS is still alive and around today. I've met many CMS missionaries over the years, and they're fine people. So unlike the DFMS, which is the American response to that, the DFMS no longer sends out missionaries. It's ironic. We'll get to the DFMS in a minute, though, but the CMS still actively sends out missionaries to different parts of the world. And not just short-term missionaries to go somewhere for, a few months or a few weeks. Long-term missionaries who will go for years and years, learn the language, serve the people, work with the church, engage in evangelism, so on and so forth. So the CMS is diminished, but still alive and kicking. The CMS is founded in 1799. And then, and specifically for our own Anglican history in Palestine and Jerusalem, this is going to be an important group. It is in 1809 it is founded, and it's called the London Jews Society, LJS, the London Jews Society, which I believe today has a different name. They're called the CMJ, which is the church's ministry to the Jews, or the church mission to the Jews, or something like that. But the LJS was founded with a different purpose than the CMS. The LJS was part of a millenarian movement at that time, which when they read the Bible, when they read passages from Romans and Revelation and so on, they said, before the return of Christ, the Jews are going to, in large number, turn to Christ. And therefore, we are going to organize this society to send out and to fund missionaries who will focus on this vocation of evangelizing the Jews. And many of their missionaries were, in fact, Hebrew Christians themselves. They would not have used the title Messianic Jew. They did not have that title at the time. But on the other hand, they certainly would not have said that they had converted to Christianity in terms of, I'm no longer Jewish, but now I am Christian. That would not have been a concept that they would have endorsed either. So they were Hebrew Christians. Okay, so not Gentile Christians like presumably most of us, but Hebrew Christians. And the LJS had numerous Hebrew Christians among its people, and we're going to get to some of those people here shortly. 1799 and 1809, the CMS and the LJS. There are other groups that are established as well. The SPCK, the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge, and SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and so on. But for our focus, where we're looking, CMS and LJS are two of the main bodies that we need to keep in mind. Well, during this millenarian period, you have people then, as now, and yes, these were Anglicans, and they would read the book of Revelation, and they would be very impacted by, the scrolls and the bowls and so on and so forth, and the keys and all these great apocalyptic images. And one of the verses that really kind of creeped into a lot of people's minds was this obscure verse from, I believe it's Revelation chapter 6, and it says, "And the Euphrates will be dried up in preparation for the kings of the east." In preparation for the kings of the east. So you put all this together, the idea that many Jews are going to come into the kingdom. You put this together with an ascendant British Empire and with a declining Ottoman Empire. You put this together with the ability to go out and to explore, and you really come to the next period in history And again, I'm not going to give you discrete years, because you can never really do that in history. It's very hard to say the period of the chaplains ended in such and such a year. The period of the explorers began in such and such a year. But a man named Joseph Wolfe. Now, Wolfe was born in 1795, making him about 14 years younger than Henry Martin, though he would live much longer. He was born in Germany, and he was a Hebrew Christian. He was baptized originally as a Roman Catholic, and only later on moved into the Anglican communion. He wrote, he was prolific, he wrote quite a bit, and he traveled all over the place. So this is when we have moved from the period of the chaplains into the period of the discovery, the journeys, the researches. That's probably the best way to put it, the period of the researches. And Joseph Wolfe, who gains a reputation as being incredibly impetuous and courageous, and he's going all over the place. I mean, he's going into all these places, and he's actually looking for the lost tribes of Israel, because he's going over there so he can preach to the lost tribes, and also in preparation so that the kings of the East, who are presumably these lost tribes, so that they will be able to come and cross the Euphrates and engage in this millenarian battle over in the plain that is below Har-Megiddo, or Armageddon, as it is more popularly known, which for me is very ironic, because for me the valley of Armageddon is not, it's the valley I drive through when I'm on my way to Tel Aviv, so it maybe doesn't have some of that mystique that it has for some people. But anyway, and Wolfe travels all over the place, all the way into Mesopotamia, Armenia, Kurdistan, and he eventually publishes, again, numerous books, but the travels and adventures of the Reverend Joseph Wolfe is one of the key volumes that he publishes. Well, he never finds the lost tribes, but again, this is a period of journeys. This is a period of researches. This whole massive area of the globe is unknown to Christians. Remember, it was Christians that decided to figure out a different way to get to the Indies so they could trade. Because the Ottomans, let's just say they didn't give very good customer service. You know, your merchants, they were not secure. They didn't have rule of law. Maybe one time they could come through and the local ruler was in a good mood and you were fine. Maybe the next time he decided he didn't like you, so he just let his people butcher your merchants. Maybe you got a firm guarantee from the Ottoman port in Istanbul, or really Constantinople, saying you have safe passage, and that would have worked in the British Empire, that would have worked in the French Empire, but it didn't work with the Ottoman Empire. You know, the guy would look at it and say, well, this is more of a recommendation, and it was just an extremely dangerous and hectic thing, and Christians, not just because of missionary zeal, but indeed for economic and political reasons as well, they did not want to go through that land. They wanted to find a different way to the Indies. Now, what you have here then is not all these, but a couple of courageous, or maybe foolhardy, depending on how you judge a person's character. You get a couple of these people and they're saying, I'm going to just go in there, I'm just going to travel all over the place. Probably the most famous of these volumes, I mentioned the one by Joseph Wolfe already, which has the rather outrageous title, the Travels and Adventures of the Reverend Joseph Wolfe. But probably the most famous one of it is just called Researches in Armenia. And like all books back then, these books have these really lengthy titles, but in we usually abbreviate them. So Researches in Armenia is published by two American Presbyterians. It's not published by Anglicans, but Researches in Armenia just opens wide the imagination of a generation or two of missions-minded individuals. And now they hear about the mountain Kurds, and they hear about the Nestorian Christians, or those whom today, because of Anglican missionaries, we would call Assyrians. They hear about all these exotic and amazing groups of people, and it just piques your curiosity. It had been before out of mind, out of sight. Well, now it's in your sight, or rather out of sight, out of mind. Now it's in your sight. Now you've got that book there, and you can read about the adventures of Joseph Wolf, or you can read about the missionary researches in Armenia and the surrounding countries. And that book was published in 1834. I'm not sure if there's an earlier edition, but the one I'm familiar with is 1834. And that was published by two, like I said, two Americans named Smith and Dwight. Those were their surnames. Well, Joseph Wolf was part of this age of exploration. And of course, he was not successful. He never found the lost tribes of Israel. And also, he never figured out who exactly the kings of the East were. But he made a real contribution in terms of just the knowledge of what these different cities were like. And what would it be like to prepare to go be a missionary in, say, Baghdad or Isfahan or what have you. Now, there's a couple of other people that are worth mentioning. And most of the CMS people were Anglicans, but not all of them. And I think that Carl Fander, that's Pfander, he's a CMS missionary to Agra in North India. And the reason I mention him is because this is when you're starting to get into the age of, or not the age, but into the movement of polemics. Okay, polemics, not in terms of being mean or being rude, but really saying, you Muslims believe in X, Y, and Z, here's why X, Y, and Z are wrong. Now, maybe your kind of pluralistic Episcopalian sensitivities are injured by this today, but this is exactly the language that many Muslims know, and they understand it. And Fander wrote a book engaging in this sort of polemic, and Fander is German, and I think he was Lutheran. I don't think he ever became Anglican, though. I can check on that. And he wrote a book called Mizanul Haq, which means the balance of truth, wherein he goes and he vindicates the Christian faith and he refutes certain key teachings of Islam. And it's easily available online, the Mizanul Haq, or just the balance of truth. And Fander, again, with the CMS. Another curious figure that I want to mention is a guy named George Percy Badger. He's one of these figures that kind of has a sort of shady reputation. You're not really sure if you like him or not. And see, Badger was significant because rather than being on the strongly evangelical side, he was on the Anglo-Catholic side. Remember that this is the 19th century, and you have strong voices and a strong disagreements in England about this topic of, well, is Anglicanism reformed but retaining certain aspects of Catholicism, or is the Church of England one of the three Catholic branches of the Church? And we are not like those other Protestants. We still have apostolic succession. We have bishops. Those guys don't. We still have the 7 sacraments. Those guys don't. This is going to be a huge question, and it's going to affect a lot of things, and we'll get to that in a minute. But Badger was on the Anglo-Catholic side of that, or maybe what some people would eventually call the Tractarian side. And Badger was active both in Iran, or Persia, and he was also then later, he was part of a kerfuffle that happened in the city of Constantinople. Now, what's interesting about the Anglicans over in Persia and Kurdistan is that you've got to understand that there was this thing that was called the Great Experiment. This is not my own phrase. This is a phrase from the Presbyterian scholar of mission Bob Blincoe, B-L-I-N-C-O-E. And as he was writing his history of Christian missions in Kurdistan, he was analyzing the different missionary strategies that different people were using. And he came to the conclusion, he said, look, basically what these people did was they didn't decide to engage in direct evangelism of Muslims. That's key. They did not engage in direct evangelism of Muslims. Or if they did so, it was on a sporadic, occasional basis. But that was not their program. If you said, sum up for me in 3 or 4 sentences what you're going to do, they would not say, we are going to evangelize Muslims. That is not what they would have said. Rather, they went over there, and this comes out of this whole research movement. The researches in Armenia, the accounts from Joseph Wolff, and many other records as well. And they say, look, we've gone over there and we've seen what happens to people who evangelize Muslims. And they get killed. And we've seen what happens if a Muslim leaves Islam. They get killed. And it's dangerous and it's hard, and really we've got to figure out some other strategy. How is God going to bring all these Muslims into the church? And they come up with a great idea. Well, what to them seems like a great idea, in reality it would have some truly disastrous consequences. And this is what Blincoe coins the Great Experiment. And this is the Great Experiment. As these people like Smith and Dwight and Wolff and several other explorers went around on their missionary research journeys, they found all these pockets of Christians belonging to these ancient churches. You know, you probably have heard of them. The Church of the East, which is also called the Nestorians. The Anglicans, once they got there, they said this is pejorative. Let's not call them Nestorians, let's call them Assyrians, even though today there's a consensus that these people ethnically have no relation to the historical Assyrians of the Bible, but whatever. We'll call them Assyrians. So that's the Assyrian Church of the East, which did not accept the Council of Ephesus in 431. They ran into non-Chalcedonian Christians, like the Armenian Catholic Church, or rather the Armenian Catholic Apostolic Church, which is non-Chalcedonian. And they just ran into a lot of different groups, small remaining Christian groups. So what they said was, here's how we've got to do this, people. These people, the Assyrians, the Armenians, the Greeks, they already know the language and they know the culture of the Muslims. So let's go and reform those churches, and then those churches will become a light to their Muslim neighbors. That is the Great Experiment right there. So all these different missions, Baptist, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, Anglican, started to really focus their time and energy on the idea of reforming these ancient churches. And they were quite clear that they were reforming the churches. In their minds, by and large, there were a couple of Anglican exceptions, which I'm going to get to in a minute. By and large, when you read the missionary journals and articles of the time, you almost always find these churches called either the decayed churches or the corrupted churches. Some people use just really offensive language, just saying, you know, these Christians are idolatrous, oftentimes superstitious. But thanks be to God, these Protestants who have the Reformed faith, who know that you don't have to do all this ridiculous stuff about like priestly celibacy and you don't need to have a bishop because we got the priesthood of all believers and blah blah blah. They come there and they say, look, this is really good. Okay, you're here, you've been here for centuries, but now we're here and we're going to reform your church. Okay? We've come here, no need to say thank you, and we're going to reform your church.